And Dr. George Reklaitis, thank you. Thank you for holding space for us.
Thank you, Angela. Wow. Yeah, I need a moment after that. That was amazing. I think I might need you to do that for every class I teach. But thank you for that, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And just looking at those, messages that everyone was posting in the chat, and some of the words being used, and then of course this powerful poem that we just heard. It reminds me that when you think about it, we're all refugees in one way or another, aren't we? Maybe not in this generation, but in previous generations. Certainly, that's where I got my start in history. As a child of immigrants fleeing Lithuania after World War II, a process that we're seeing happen again right now. I noticed Janina has joined us, also of Lithuanian descent. And so I know that some of the questions that you guys posted, I'll try my best to answer. My plan is just to give a brief overview of the history of Ukraine. One of the questions that everyone's been asking is why is this happening? Well, the simplest answer really is Vladimir Putin. President Vladimir Putin of Russia does not believe that Ukraine is a nation, does not believe that Ukraine is home for 40 plus million people. He believes, and has always believed, at least through his political statements, that Ukraine has never been a nation. Ukraine was simply created as a province of Russia, and there it should remain. One conversation that's always been part of Russian historiography is Russia on its own is a country. Russia with Ukraine is an empire. And Vladimir Putin has on a number of occasions stipulated that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was, and using his words, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And by just tracing his actions as president of Russia for the last 20 plus years, he has certainly, stayed on that path of restoring Russia's grandeur, making up for perceived slights and failures on the part of Russia, making up for what he perceived were embarrassments that Russia had to suffer through when its economy collapsed in the late 1990s, when it was led by the caricature of a drunken Russian in the form of Boris Yeltsin. And so, yeah, the short answer is Vladimir Putin's behind this war. And so, what I want to address as concisely but as clearly as I can is that he's wrong. Ukraine is a nation. Ukraine is a home. Ukraine is a sovereign state, and a sovereign state that has a history. So, if I may segue, and hopefully this will appear for everyone. When we try to understand Ukrainian war, on the one hand, I do feel that it is that simple. Vladimir Putin, having spent 20 years establishing his own rock-solid control of Russia, is now exercising what he believes is his almost czarist ambitions, if you will, to restore Russia to its former state as a global empire. Now, does this restoration include, right, extending Russia all the way into the former communist bloc? Potentially not. But is Vladimir Putin concerned about consistent Western encroachments, Western influence? So it's not just whether Ukraine is going to join the European Union or whether Ukraine has, hopes to join NATO. It's the fact that the Ukraine historically, as we'll see, has always been caught in the middle, between what we might consider the West or Western Europe, and then more traditional Russian culture, more traditional Russian political thought and ideology. The Ukraine itself, some of you have probably learned this in your investigations of this crisis. And by the way, this is where I'd like to throw out a disclaimer and tell you that I don't have any specific real-time information, or I'm not in direct communication with anyone involved in this process. So anything that you've come across in your studies and in your perusal of the news headlines, many of which Angela shared with us, is about what I know about what's going on right now. But the Ukraine is suffering right now, and it's suffering again. Ukraine, by the way, means borderland. That is the meaning of the term Ukraine, and it has been a borderland. It has been the crossroad of Europe, where the confluence of many different historical forces have gone up and down across this region. And if there's one, and maybe I'll start optimistically. Angela's gotten me in the right mood. Is that Ukraine has persevered for centuries, and so, as you may have heard from some Ukrainians or Ukrainian Americans, Ukraine is a country, is a home, was a country, was a home, and will continue to be this land of amber waves of grain and corn, of fields of sunflowers, all under a blue sky. Look, now I'm getting poetic as well, but reflected in the Ukrainian flag, on the bottom, the breadbasket of Europe, as it's known, and on the top horizon, the blue skies. Ukraine, as Angela already identified for us on the map, right there, nestled among the great powers of Europe, itself one of the largest countries in Europe, with the exception of Russia, whose bulk is mostly in Asia. Ukraine then becomes the largest country, actually, in the continent of Europe, the size of Texas, as we said before, home to over 40 million people. Unfortunately, millions of those have already fled, but influence from all sides, and I'm going to my trusty pen here. But you'll have influence from the Byzantines in the south. You'll of course have influence from Catholicism, influence from Vikings and Balts, and of course the Slavs and Russians from the east. And so, as far as what I like to do throughout my brief comments here is, as I show you a series of historical maps, I'll try to keep overlaying kind of the current Ukrainian borders to give you a sense of how this state has shifted, has been partitioned and reassembled, only to then be occupied and reoccupied. And to that extent, honestly, when one studies the breadth of Ukrainian history, it's a marvel at how much the people of Ukraine have gone through historically. And apparently, Vladimir Putin is not a very close studier of history, because even after, perhaps this will wind up on his laptop at some point. because even after a 20-minute presentation from a community college professor in New Jersey, I think even he should understand that Ukraine will not go quietly in the night, regardless of what pressures or what plans Vladimir Putin has. In any event, a really quick jump backwards to a state that was originally settled as far back as 39,000 BCE, and we're not going to linger there. But within the modern period, the Common Era, we do see the earliest, and that's pronounced Cucuteni Tripilian culture that is established in early vestiges of the Ukraine. But the Ukraine has almost early legacy of being parceled and sectioned off, whether it was as a Roman colony, whether it was under the influence of the Greeks and eventually the Macedonians in the south. When you have the Finns and Balts moving in as well, the Goths, the Huns, it seems like Ukraine has witnessed all sorts of historical forces and peoples move through its territory, who on the one hand have contributed in some respects to Ukrainian culture, but on the other hand, none of which stayed around very long until Ukraine continues to thrive. Eventually, we see the creation of Kievan Rus, in which the city-state, and as Angela pointed out, this is the Russified version of Kiev. But the Kievan kingdom in the south was largely the predominant ruler of this large confederation, again, of Finns, of Balts, of even Scandinavians. There's evidence that Vikings moved down the Dnieper River and eventually settled in these areas, and we eventually begin to see some loose federation eventually run by a Kievan prince named Vladimir, who controlled most of the territory. We will cut away sections of this region for now, because while Kiev ruled a large area of Eastern Europe, largely what we refer to as the Muscovy states or the Muscovy principalities were relatively small and dare I say insignificant parts of this region at the time. So again, if you'll pardon my scrawling, but Kievan Rus was largely centered in modern day Ukraine and bits of Poland. Again, if I may overlay, and I don't know how well you can see that, but there is our modern day Ukraine fitting right in to the region there. But along come the Mongols, and as they did in China, as they do in Persia, and as they'll do in Central Asia, the Mongols come in and overwhelm most of the settled territories, both in Eastern Europe and even in central Ukraine. So in this sense, the Golden Horde, those of you familiar with Mongolian history, the Golden Horde was one of the khanates of the Mongolian Empire, which now settles in Central and Eastern Europe, and is responsible for largely shattering and diminishing Kievan rule over the Rus, which allows for these princes in Muscovy to now assert some authority. And it's the Muscovy princes who will put up the first significant resistance to Mongolian rule. And eventually we'll see some of the earliest Muscovy princes overthrow the Mongol yoke, as it's known, and establish their own kingdom. So out of Kievan Rus, historians state that spring out not one but two cultures and political entities, both what we would now consider the culture of modern Ukraine and that of modern Russia. So already from an early state, these two regions are intertwined. Eventually, this area will fall into civil war as competition for this territory begins fiercely as the Kievan princes regain their authority. But you have the Tatars, who are the remnants of Mongol settlement in the Crimea, now attempt to assert themselves in this region as well. And eventually, it's one Tatarian warlord, or Cossacks, as are more commonly known in modern historical lingo. These Cossacks form their own state, and under the leadership of a warlord by the name of Bodin Hemletsky, are able to gain limited autonomy for themselves right there in the Ukrainian steppe. In fact, Hmeletsky achieves enough notoriety, enough power that in 1654 he marches into the city kingdom of Kiev and announces that he wishes to be the new leader of a Ukrainian region centered essentially in between the Dnieper and the Don rivers. And with Russian approval, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, is signed in 1654, briefly giving these Ukrainian Cossacks autonomy. Sadly, as will happen to most of the smaller states of Eastern Europe, this treaty does not hold. It's actually within 12 years that the stipulations of the treaty are violated by both the Russians and the growing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west, who eventually will occupy the central region of the Tatars. And again, we'll do the overlay so you can see. This was roughly the region that was contested. And now you see it's going to be divided right along the banks of the Dnieper between the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so much of the Ukraine, as you can see here, it will remain in Polish hands for the time being. But now we begin to see also a movement by which Ukraine is being pulled into both political but cultural directions. So you now have a Ukraine that is still made up of individuals who mostly speak Ukrainian, who have ties to earlier Ukrainian societies and customs, but who now are becoming more entrenched in, say, Western society, Western cultures. With their close proximity to the Byzantine Empire, the earliest Ukrainian societies had adopted Orthodox Christianity. But now the western half of this region, with its allegiance now under Polish and Lithuanian control, a commonwealth that was closely affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church, the western part of Ukraine is now being pulled also in a religious direction, whereas the territories in the east will still be largely associated with Orthodox Christianity. So the issue of Ukraine being Russian is not accurate. The issue of Ukraine being influenced by both Russian and Western European cultures is, but that does not make that does not undermine Ukraine's sovereignty or its unity. The idea of a diverse nation is certainly not a weakness, as many of us can attest to. However, for those of you who are students of East European history, you know that the boundaries of these states, even some as large as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, are fleeting in nature. And by the late 1700s, the growing Romanov dynasty in Russia is slowly but surely expanding its influence at the expense of its Polish neighbors, to the point where it now occupies both much of the former territories of Lithuania, the former territories of Poland, and of course, let's do our overlay one more time, much, if not all, of the territories of Ukraine. So in this sense, Ukraine now becomes almost fully under Russian control, and under beginning with the Tsarina, Catherine the Great, full Russification measures begin. Catherine even is going to refer to this region that she had annexed, particularly the Ukrainian region, as the Novorossiya, which simply means the new Russia, in which she hoped that the geographic proximity, but also the somewhat cultural similarities and the linguistic um, uh, foundations of both Ukrainian and Russian languages and the Slavic ethnicities would eventually allow this newly added part of the Russian Empire to simply kind of be absorbed. And we'll come back to this idea in a minute. But this notion of a Ukraine still being divided, the area of Galicia here, which again, part of the Ukraine, traditionally and today, will actually be occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So here now you see both political, social, and now even economic differences, where a Russian Empire that economically, particularly in this central region, was largely agricultural, so largely depended on a peasant working class. Contrasts that with the western half, where many of the Ukrainian landlords assimilated into originally Polish culture and now into the Habsburg dynasty that they are under.
George, if I interrupt you for 1 minute with a question that does relate to what you're covering right now. Richard asks, can you please give approximate dates of these events?
My pleasure, Richard. So 1795 is when the eventual treaty between Russia, the state of Prussia, and the Habsburg dynasty of Austria-Hungary will be signed, and thus officially dissolving the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And then these three parties kind of carved up whatever territories they wanted to. And so as we're entering into the 20th century now, World War I begins, and World War I, ironically, will feature Ukraine, or Ukrainians, I should say, fighting on both sides. So you'll have Ukrainians fighting for the Austro-Hungarian army, which of course was part of the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance, and then you'll have Ukrainians fighting on behalf of the Tsarist army, which was allied with Britain and France for at least a few years. But after the war, and again, please keep those questions coming. I just wanted to get through as much information as possible, but I'll be happy to clarify anything and be happy to come back to any of these slides if you wish. But this is what things look like. So, Richard, if you're scoring at home, this is right the world in 1918, 1919, right? The Russia, which had withdrawn from the war in 1917 and fallen under Bolshevik communist control, cedes many of its western territories. So you see the reemergence, and then we'll appreciate Lithuania's reestablishment of nationhood. Poland reasserts itself now as an independent country. Missing, of course, on this map is any mention of the Ukraine, which largely will remain as part of Soviet territory, and then the rest will be seized by Poland. Now, briefly, in 1917 and again in 1919, Ukrainians will declare their sovereignty, declare their independence, and for a brief moment, there is a Democratic Republic of the Ukraine, which immediately comes under attack by both Poland and the newly formed Red Army, the Bolshevik forces coming out of Russia. And so while 1917 into 1919 is considered the first official establishment of a Ukrainian state, the existence of that Ukrainian state does not last for long, as it once again finds itself under the leadership of its neighbors. In this case, only a slight sliver of Ukraine is now under Polish control, whereas the bulk of modern day Ukraine is now going to be in the process of being Sovietized. And one of the Bolshevik generals charged with seizing control of, in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, this breakaway republic is none other than Joseph Jugashvili, or Joseph Stalin. So Stalin was in command of the forces who in 1919 reestablished Russian control over the Ukraine. And then upon achieving power as leader of the Soviet Union in 1927, Stalin looks at the Ukraine as, well, a potential source of resistance and trouble. And so for this, the Ukraine will suffer greater than any region before, during, or after World War II. The Ukraine, of course, being the breadbasket, meaning being the chief provider of wheat and corn to not just Russia or Poland, but to much of Western Europe, will be a necessary and vital part of the Russian Empire. And it will also be targeted for collectivization. Stalin's policy to nationalize all the private farms in the Ukraine and put them under Soviet state control. A process that, as you're looking at this Soviet propaganda, was supposed to be the utopian ideal of communism, where all of the members of this new proletarian society would come together and share the work and share the resources and share the benefits of this new society. Not surprisingly, most Ukrainian farmers were not willing to go along with this policy, which was essentially, other than what these images attempt to demonstrate, forcible seizure of their land by Soviet authorities. And so, as a response to this attempted forcible seizure, many Ukrainian farmers destroy their crops, slaughter their livestock, or refuse to produce more grain. The result, well, in Ukraine is referred to as the Holodomor. Western historians have often referred to it as the Ukrainian famine. The United Nations, back in the year 2000, designated it as an act of genocide, by which, and some of these images are a bit graphic, but by which more than 7 million Ukrainians will die, most of starvation. And so on the one hand, the famine that grips the Ukraine during this period from 1932 to 1933 is, in some respects, a product of Ukrainian resistance to Stalinist collectivization. It's also a product, though, of hurried industrialization, which destroyed a good bulk of Ukraine's farmlands to serve the purpose of Stalin's hope to industrialize the Soviet Union rapidly, which he is able to accomplish, but again, at a great human cost. And in the midst of this massive human catastrophe, another reason why it's going to be referred to as a genocide is, Stalin refused to accept any aid from outside sources. Not that this event was being publicized internationally, but rumors abounded. And when agencies like the Red Cross or the League of Nations came and consulted with Stalin, he turned them away, saying there's no problems here, everything's fine. And meanwhile, Stalin's grain exports, or Russia's grain exports in general, will increase dramatically during this period. So Stalin did have the food on hand, but chose to punish the Ukrainians for their intransigence, for their resistance, by diverting it to other countries for profit. So with this kind of treatment and suffering through, again, 7 million deaths in 1 year. Just for context, 11 million men will die during 4 years of fighting during World War I. That's all armies total combined. We know, of course, the 6.5 million Jews who will perish during the Holocaust over the course of 5 or 6 years. This is 7 million in just 1 year. So perhaps we might gain some understanding of why, when in 1941, German armies marched into the Ukraine as part of their invasion of the greater Soviet Union, many Ukrainians saw this as relief, saw this as a potential alternative to the horrors that they had suffered under Stalin. Some Ukrainians, and I emphasize the word some Ukrainians will even join with the Nazis, both in their military escapades and in their persecution of the local Jewish populations. And here, I don't mean to isolate the Ukrainians, or even, again, generalize as to say that all Ukrainians were Nazi collaborators. By no means. But there were some collaborators in the Ukraine, much like there were in other Nazi-occupied territories in the Soviet Union, which would include parts of Poland, parts of Belarus, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. Again, not painting with a wide brush and saying all of these inhabitants collaborated in the persecution and genocide of the Jewish residents, but there were some who hope that by collaborating with German authorities, they may preserve a semblance of autonomy for their local society, their local culture. Sadly, this didn't materialize in any of the regions that the Nazis occupied. But the Nazi occupation of these areas also unleashed ethnic conflicts that had long been simmering and had long been in check, largely thanks to Russian and then Soviet occupations, but particularly in the Ukraine, a region that had seen its fair share of landlords, of occupiers, both sides, both the Nazis and the Soviets, who were going to occupy parts of the Ukraine during the course of the war, will play upon, right, ethnic tensions, long, as it says, long forged friendships, that now these different groups use the cover and specter of war to enact whatever, largely imagined ideas of vengeance they needed to approximate. And so, one of the issues we cover in my history of the Second World War is that, the German invasion into the Soviet Union is not as simple as one country invading the other. The war in the East, as we call it, is going to have multiple layers of war, of conflict, of genocide, none of which we have time to get into today. So let me move on. After the war, Ukraine, as a Soviet Socialist Republic, actually gained some measure of autonomy. So while it is still a Soviet republic, while it is still part of the contiguous Soviet Union, it is given some territory, some political autonomy. Nikita Khrushchev, the successor to Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union, will in fact even add additional lands to the Ukrainian Soviet state. The one we might particularly want to pay our attention to is the addition of Crimea to the Ukraine in 1954, which was done to mark the 600th anniversary of the creation of the first autonomous Ukrainian territories back in 1654. Ukraine also makes its mark on Soviet history by producing one of the Soviet Union's future leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, although the details of his birth aren't completely accurate. Our understanding is that he was of Ukrainian descent. But I need to move on. Here is the world after the Cold War ends. So the Ukraine will be one of 15 Soviet republics that will vote for autonomy from the Soviet Union. And while initially the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia form what will be known as a Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991, soon these three states create their own national independence. And so in 1991, Ukraine officially, for the first time since 1919, becomes a sovereign state. Nonetheless, the specter of Russian influence is there. And so we begin to see the process of the post-Soviet era, in which you have international organizations such as NATO formed partly as, an element of the Cold War. So the United States forming its own coalition originating in 1949, Stalin responding with the Warsaw Pact, his own states. But of course, as the former Soviet republics gained their independence, more and more of them, including the Baltic states up here, began to seek membership in NATO. They also began to seek membership in the EU, the European Union. And this is where we begin to see the newly installed president of Russia in 1999, Vladimir Putin, begin to grow concerned. In the Ukraine, by 2004, there is a growing movement of unrest. The Ukraine had suffered much in the same way as some of its sister republics, and much in the same way that Russia had suffered after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Economic disaster, followed by bribery, corruption, political malfeasance. And so in the years of the new millennia, you begin to see a growing movement of resistance and rebellion within the Ukraine against, technically, its own leadership. But that's completely appropriate. Ukraine is a sovereign state, as a democracy, has the right to disapprove of the job its government is doing. And in the early 2000s, this disapproval was growing quite vocal. By 2004, it had grown into what will be referred to as the Orange Revolution, led by the man whose face you can't see here, Viktor Yuschenko, who in 2004 is going to be running for president of the Ukraine. And his platform was one of seeking to join the European Union, seeking to join NATO, and seeking to escape, potentially, the grasp and influence of Russia. All of which came as, well, maybe not so much a shock, but as a concern, let's say, to Vladimir Putin. Some of you may remember what happens to Viktor Yuschenko, who, after meeting with a representative of the Russian FSB, the FSB is the Russian equivalent of their FBI, although most commentators have equated it more with the KGB. But after a meeting with the Russian FSB, Yuschenko reported feeling unwell. Soon his face was covered with pustules and scarring. And while his health will recover, he will remain physically disfigured. And all signs point to Russian involvement in his poisoning. And for those of you who've been following Russia over the last 30 years, this is part of a larger trend. In any event, in spite of his disfigurement, Yuschenko wins the election, and Ukraine now begins a process of westernization. Eventually, the Ukrainian government will have another election in 2010. This time, the president is one Viktor Yanukovych, who was elected as a financial wizard, who was elected as a reformer, who was elected on promises that he will restore Ukraine, not just politically, which had been underway, but now economically as well. But to do so, as this image indicates, he looks to Russia for support. And Vladimir Putin was more than happy to hear about this. But in response to Yanukovych's election, his promised reforms do not materialize. And so what follows is another series of protests, many of them following a similar pattern that we saw in 2004. So where 2004, the protest war against the corruption and perceived illegitimacy of the Ukrainian government, the 2013 into 2014 protests during the winter months there were known as the Euromaidan. Maidan referring to the square in which these protests were being held, because many Ukrainians believed that Yuschenko had broken his promise to align Ukraine more with the West, and now had become a puppet of Putin. And so in response to these growing protests, this time, unlike those in 2004, which were largely peaceful, this time Ukrainian police forces are called out to put down the mobs. Several dozen Ukrainians will die during these protests. Eventually, in the midst of the protests, the Ukrainian president flees and finds refuge in Russia. But meanwhile, Vladimir Putin sends his troops first into the Crimea and then into the borderlands on the eastern regions of the Ukraine, populated, I wouldn't say predominantly by Russians, but approximately a quarter of the population of those territories, which we now refer to as the Donbas region, were ethnic Russians. And so Putin initially sent in special forces that did not have insignias on their uniforms so that he could issue plausible deniability that he wasn't involved, which is what was the official storyline coming from the Kremlin, that the troop movements, the fighting, and the conflict that was going on in these areas in mid-2014 was just native Ukrainians rebelling against the Ukrainian leadership, who were frightened about the ongoing protests in Kiev, etc. But soon, with Crimea's surrender to the hostile forces, the Russian flag begins fluttering all over the place, and eventually, Putin, with a wry grin, gives a press conference in which he congratulates his soldiers for their liberation of these territories from decadent Ukrainian control. So this is the preamble to, of course, the events of the past month. And while on the one hand, we can speak from a political standpoint that Putin has always been concerned of Western encroachment, has been alarmed, I think maybe that's the best word to use, alarmed that these former Soviet republics are becoming closer and closer allied with the West. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, become part of the European Union. Belarus has essentially a puppet government that takes its orders from Moscow, which is why Putin was able to stage and launch invasions into the Ukraine in attempts to seize its capital over the last month. But the Ukraine has been seen as A, historically part of Russia from Putin's perspective, and B, he also views it as this potential passageway. If Western influence grows too great, what's stopping yet another invasion of Russia. Napoleon, Hitler, and now who else? So that's one reason why Putin has had interest in gaining control, at least of certain areas of the Ukraine. But of course, you don't have to be a cynic to understand that there are things that lie below the surface. And in this case, I mean literally below the surface. Ukraine, on the one hand, is home to a series of major pipelines that transports a bulk, almost half of Russian oil into Western Europe. And so in this way, the Ukraine is the lifeblood, to some extent, of Russia's exports of oil and natural gas, without which, the sale of which would essentially leave Russia bankrupt. So Putin's interest in controlling the Ukraine are not just for political purposes, but because the Ukraine does have, the opportunity to shut down these pipelines and cause Russia some serious economic calamities. Some of you know that Germany, and surprisingly under some pressure, managed to shut down Nord Stream 2, which is a second pipeline being constructed under the Baltic Sea that would circumvent the Ukrainian pipelines. So this was a part of the attempts of sanctioning the Russian regime. And this next map, I think, will give you some further indications of why the Ukraine is critical to Putin, because the Ukraine itself is home to numerous swaths of natural gas, most of it located in pockets of shale, which, if you look at the locations, are coincidentally in regions that Putin has been very interested in gaining influence over, including the Crimea down in the south and the Donbass region in the east. So why? Yes, on the one hand, Putin has some designs of restoring what he perceives as the true Russia, righting the wrongs of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the realization that the Ukraine is pivotal to Russia's livelihood, and therefore, as long as Putin is in charge and he's the one controlling the oil, he can secure his own position of power. So we can throw out all the ideas of ideas of grandeur and czarist behavior, but in some ways, Putin's just a crook who wants his hands on the bloody oil. This is the most recent developments. As we've seen, the Ukraine has been able to push back in some respects, but as we sit, they are still suffering in this region, as millions have managed to flee the country, but tens of millions still lay in wait of what's going to happen next. So with that, I'll end my formal presentation and attempt to address questions and invite what comments you folks in the